Hello, and welcome to You Are Not the Problem, a podcast on how to move from trauma to possibility.
Together, we will explore the deeper truth. You are not broken. You are not crazy. You are responding exactly as your body was designed to, in a world that profits from your disconnection.
This podcast dismantles the myths of the healing industrial complex and dives into the collective unconscious that keeps us stuck in cycles of shame, burnout, and self-blame.
We explore how trauma lives in systems and how rediscovering your intuition, body, and community can become a radical act of resistance.
Because maybe it's not you that needs fixing, maybe it's the world.
This podcast is hosted by 3 holistic healers.
Hey, I'm Camille, sex and relationships therapist, intuitive tarot reader, and professional witch.
Hello, I'm Doris. I've been a nurse for almost 25 years and a practicing herbalist for 15. Now I'm a burnout recovery specialist.
Hi, I'm Isabella, a holistic trauma therapist and alternative health practitioner, specializing in narcissism, abuse, and domestic violence. So in today's episode, we are talking about when love turns toxic. But before we get into that, we have a few announcements. So upcoming in the next month, Doris is hosting 2 webinars and healing huddles. She has the healing huddle on March 12th and 26th, and then the Getting Beyond Burnout workshop on March 18th. And Camille and I will be hosting our Spring Equinox online mini retreat on March 21st from 12 to 3 Pacific time. You can find the links in the show notes and in the descriptions for this episode. And of course, email us your thoughts, questions, feedback, and more at our email, nottheproblempod@gmail.com. So to come back to today's episode, when love turns toxic. As most of you know, we just had Valentine's Day, which is a holiday often celebrating love and relationships. And a common topic coming up these days is narcissism. Narcissism has become kind of this buzzword, very trendy, but not as many people really know what it means. So today we're going to really unpack a little bit more about what is narcissism, how does that show up in relationships, even beyond romantic relationships, how that shows up in systems and in other aspects of our lives, and what can we do when love turns toxic? So I wonder if maybe we could start out a little bit with Doris sharing about her experience of navigating gaslighting and emotional abuse.
Yeah, so the one big thing that comes to mind, one, there's my marriage, but also looking at the workplace, working in healthcare is I had someone that I worked with point out how healthcare is very patriarchal, where you have the doctors who, it's like this top-down management style. And so they have, they give the orders, the nurses do the orders, but also the same with the healthcare system itself. It's very much like being in an abusive relationship with a narcissist. So just the way management manipulates the emotions of the employees. Like I've heard multiple times from that I've heard myself, and that other nurses have been told about how we should do things out of the goodness of our heart. And, what about the patients, and what about the nurse, your coworkers? And it's interesting how the emotions are manipulated within professional workspaces.
Yeah, I feel like you really highlighted a big piece there around like that narcissist empath kind of paradigm. where usually a narcissist or someone with narcissistic traits, or even a system that is more narcissistic, really, utilizes and pulls on the energy of someone who is more empathic, someone who is more giving. And they kind of manipulate that generosity, that compassion, that giving nature. Right? It gives them a narcissistic supply. And it's something I see so much when people come to me for support around some narcissistic relationship. Often people will even ask, like, am I the narcissist? Which, anytime someone asks that, I'm like, well, if you're asking the question, you're probably not, because most narcissistic people never self-reflect.
And I see a lot of nurses get
it's so
in relationships
how deep
with
that manipulation goes.
narcissists, right? Because we are
on a deep
the
level
caregiving, we are the empath, we are codependent enablers, and narcissist. Like, it's a very common relationship to have narcissists with the codependent enablers, because we give a lot to the other person. And I see that same type of relationship over and over within nurses and who they partner with.
Well, and I think too, it's like empathetic people have a hard time understanding that not everyone is that way, like is as empathetic as them, is as always trying to understand the other person's perspective and side. That's definitely a thing that I talk about with clients that I have sometimes. So that's like, for empathetic people, it's hard to understand that like not everyone experiences the level of empathy that you do. And when we assume that other people do, often we get resentful because guess what? They don't. And then they're not giving in that like 120% capacity that you are. And it is almost always going to feel like this imbalance in the relationship. And like you said, that there's sort of a level of like getting used to that if that's how your workplace is, and it's not even just in healthcare, I would say there's sort of like a societal, glorification of these narcissistic or abusive traits, especially in the workplace, where it's basically like, forget yourself and your needs, do it for the bottom line, do it for the boss, do it for all of those things. And that like, it's a burden to have needs, to need time off, to have feelings, a lot of those things. And it gets so normalized that I think, then when you're in relationship, you're like, I don't know if this feels great, but it feels normal. Like I'm used to it. I'm used to just feeling like I'm giving all the time. And I think that's part of, when all of us work with people, with our own sort of clientele, that it's like, that's kind of what we're highlighting, is that particular dynamic. And then becomes the work of like, how do I get out of it? Whatever that's going to mean for the relationship, or how do I work on healing that part of myself that feels like I'm only worthy if I give 120% all the time. If I have my own needs, oh no, no one wants that. Where you start to sort of feel like indebted to others, which is, again, like a bit more of the like, where that swing from 120% to like 80%, you're giving 80%, that it starts to feel really uncomfortable, right? Because I think that's the other part. You can acknowledge that this is true, and it is this sort of like we're saying, it's like this relationship that often happens of narcissistic folks or people that have those traits and empathetic people, that like it only kind of works because that's like how the dynamic is. I'll stop there for now.
There's a big piece too. There's a big piece too in American culture where we have like the hustle culture, and where, it goes back to the Puritans that came over, and you're always supposed to be producing and busy. And if you take time off, then you're lazy. And those characteristics have really continued to thread themselves throughout our culture. And, in modern days, it's like, what's your side hustle? What are you doing on top of your full-time job? What else are you, what other kind of money are you bringing in, right? And pulling yourself up with your bootstraps. And, if you just work hard enough, then you'll make it and you'll be making enough money. And that's just not reality.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times you can work really hard and still never be like making enough money to like survive, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's kind of like the toxic ideology of it, is that like, oh, if I'm not whatever it is, yeah, being able to pay my bills, being able to save money, being able to like live this like life that I'm trying to do, that must mean I'm not working hard enough, right? It sort of works in the inverse as well, where it's like, oh, I just need to work more, I just need to wake up earlier, I just need to have another job, that really just kind of spirals into this idea that like it's a personal problem, right? That you're just not putting in enough energy.
Well, and that's how we demonize the poor, right? They're lazy, they're just not working hard enough.
Yeah.
But like our society,
when it's so common in right abusive or violent relationships where people will ask, well, why did they stay, and whenever that comes up in my work with people, I'm always like, well, why do people abuse? Maybe we should be asking that question. And sometimes it is important that we think about, well, what does keep people in these abusive systems, and how can we, of course we want to acknowledge that experience of, you are being victimized by a system or by a person who is deeply harming you, and we don't want to take away from that reality of that experience. And I think there's a certain point in the recovery of that, much later on, not in the beginning, much later on, where you start to kind of look at, what was the part of me that, believed I deserved this, or believed that I'm not good enough, or that, it was okay for someone to treat me this way. And that I think when we really heal that part of ourselves and really deepen into that knowing of, I do not deserve to be treated this way by anyone, by any boss, friend, partner, teacher, anyone, that when we're really strong in that, that's what I think really protects us from these systems. And it's not to say like, oh, it's people's fault for getting in that situation at all. But, I think there is a point where we have to, okay, we know we're in this huge system that
I think it doesn't, like our society doesn't just perpetuate those.
How do we build,
it
protection?
normalizes it,
I think
and celebrates those
from,
abusive qualities, and not just
and
like in the workplace and our overall culture, but also how women especially are conditioned to, not say no, be nice, be the nice girl, do all these things, where we are conditioned to be that codependent enabler and the caregiver, and boys are not necessarily conditioned that way. It goes back. It goes back to, how boys show affection by like pulling on the girl's hair, kind of thing. Like that's your first step of abuse right there. Like you're
I think we're told
being abusive towards someone to show that you like them.
Yeah. And I think that that's sort of where the gaslighting comes in too.
And I think women are socialized to really, be the subservient, the ever giving, the the quiet, submissive partner. And, it makes me think about how, we often see people getting obsessed with, these like kind of criminal personalities. Like I remember when this, Netflix documentary came out about, or it was like a dramatization about Ted Bundy. And, all of these women were like in love with him and, how he's so good looking. And, it's this interesting, I think, false belief sometimes that gets really deeply perpetuated of, oh, I can change him. My love can heal all wounds. And it's that fantasy, right? The bad boy fantasy that, we're sold by, all these corporations that,
Yeah,
it's
there's
our
definitely
job as a
that
woman to
false
change and fix
thought
and save a
process
man,
of
even while
I
he's
can make
deeply
him into who I
harming you.
want him to be. And that's, and it takes a very different kind of person to accept people as who they are and as they are and meet them where they are. And if they're not meeting your needs, to be able to like walk away from that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like it really helps when you have external people that are supportive. Like if you have a place to go, if you have people perhaps pointing out that like, I don't know, that doesn't seem like a super great relationship, or I'm worried about you. And I think like that's part of why people don't leave, is that other people aren't seeing what's happening behind closed doors, or they're not seeing, like, narcissists are great at pretending, at lying. And because there is often a lack of empathy, it's not hard for them, in a way that like it would feel immoral as an empathetic person. And so again, there's this sort of like, oh, I'm sort of like projecting my empathy on everyone else. And like, that's not the reality, right? Which I think is, again, like this kind of like obsession with criminals in particular, like very, yeah, violent, like obsessive serial killers that we have. And it gets like reinforced in media and other things of like, oh, well, he's nice to me, right? Like, oh, like he's not good to other people, but like, again, you don't know him like I do, where there is this level of like, well, they're nice. They take me on dates. They do these things. And like oftentimes narcissists are not like hitting you every day, or like they're not only doing like quote unquote bad things. They're also doing things that we say are nice or are like part of healthy relationships. But a bit of the intent behind it is often like this, I would say, like level of guilt, or like they're trying to like make up for something that they did, that there's this sort of like swinging back and forth between. And that is like really challenging to be in relationship with someone that like kind of shows both of these like very extreme sides. Especially if they're hiding kind of the negative sides from the outside world, because then what other people see is just like, oh wow, they seem like so nice when they're at the holiday party and when we like saw them at a cookout. And it's like, yeah, well, that's like a very small percentage of the time that we spend together. And yeah, most people can put on a particular like face or emotional like outward looking for an hour or two. But there is this whole other aspect of the relationship and like the performance of it. Like most narcissists are very aware when other people are watching, and they use that to their advantage as well.
Yeah, there's always he's such a nice guy. You don't see where people are like, he's such a nice guy. Couldn't see him as a serial killer.
Like that's not how it works. Like,
Yeah.
And it's this.
Yeah, it's like a trope. And like I listen to a lot of like true crime, that like the joke is that, oh yeah, the like serial killing man that was doing it for decades, everyone's like, he's such a nice guy, he's like the head of the church, like and it's like, yeah, no, like people seek out places of power. And like they know what's gonna look good. Like they are very hyper aware of like how society works and what to do to kind of like again, put on a performance of like what other people expect from
Right.
a quote unquote like good person in that way.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the stories that sometimes come out about people who are married to serial killers or are like, oh, I think my dad was a serial killer, and yeah, like they blend into society, and these traits that they exhibit are also very, like, they are very intentionally manipulative of
Yeah.
people's emotions.
Yeah, well, it's making me think of, right, we talked about Ted Bundy. Like, yeah, famously, Ted Bundy, like, when he took women from Lake Sammamish, I think, or anyway, when he was in the Seattle area near where we all live, he pretended to have a broken arm, I think, to have a woman help him, like, take things to his car, and then, like, took her from there. And it's like, yeah, he literally was, like, playing into, right, like the idea of like I need help, like empathy, like I need you to help me with this thing, as that like perfect example of the kind of like enabling relationship that we're talking about, where it's like, yeah, you're not really on guard if you think like, oh, like he seems nice, like he seems like he needs help, like, so that's really playing into kind of like it might turn off the parts of our brain, the red flag, like, this feels weird, or like, I'm alone with a man that I don't know anything about, in that way. Yeah.
And I think a big part of that too is like that narcissistic mask, right? That they have this false persona that they portray to the world. That, you know, sometimes I think we have a very certain idea of someone who's narcissistic, that they're, the very kind of obvious idea of someone who's
Yeah.
really arrogant and full of themselves and like constantly taking selfies and just like very self-obsessed. But narcissistic people can be, people who are constantly doing volunteer work, because it actually is a way for them to show to other people, "Oh, look at how good of a person I am. Look, I take pictures for, kids with cancer, and I run a nonprofit." And actually the most common professions for people who are narcissistic is doctors and lawyers, right? These people who are, supposedly these, people who save other people who help other people, right? The do-gooders. And of course, not to say that, people who do good things are narcissistic, right? But that it can be a way for people to hide, right? They hide behind this kind of false persona of, look at the external world, I'm a good person, but internally, I and incredibly manipulative and very harmful,
Mm-hmm.
and especially behind closed doors, right? It's rare that happens out in the public eye, and that's why often when you get into these abusive or toxic dynamics, people will question the victim, because they'll say, oh, well, I never saw that person behave that way. Well, it's like, well, yeah, because you were never behind closed doors. Or usually that narcissistic person will actually target someone who either they are envious of in some way to try and tear them down, or someone they see as vulnerable. And so, if a narcissist has something to gain from someone, they'll never harm that person because they want to gain something from them. And so it's always
Yeah.
the people
Yeah,
who
I laugh
are, the
because
most
when you
vulnerable,
said
that they
doctors
tend
are
to be the
one of the
ones who
most
get harmed
narcissist
the most.
professions, I'm like, yeah. And they marry a lot of nurses who are codependent and they wish.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's like, right, there's built-in extreme hierarchy, right, in lawyer positions, in doctor, healthcare positions, and therapy, right? Like a lot of these are dynamics where you are in a room with like a singular person. Often their life is like literally in your hands. And it like, there's also that sort of like God complex part that I think often gets talked about with doctors, but I think is sort of similar in those roles. Also, they're all very like respected professions. Yeah, often get paid more than like the average other jobs. And yeah, it is interesting where I'm like, yeah, that like looking for jobs where, I mean, even like head of a church, like, or like, right, other positions, where it's like, yeah, there's extreme power dynamics built in already. And narcissists are like, ooh, sounds great, right? Now I'm gonna have people question me even less, or I'm gonna, right, sort of be performing what other people think is like a good person in that way. And it's like, yeah, it's often very strategic and calculating. And I think, yeah, like what Isabella was talking about earlier, it's like we have this idea of just like sort of like narcissist as like an evil villain, where it's like, yeah, there's this level of like calculation that comes into it. It's all, I'd say a lot of things are very intentional, and not necessarily that they're sitting around reflecting on things, but just that the intention behind all of their actions is like, what do I want and what will like make me look good. Yeah, because right, like the word narcissist comes from the sort of like mirror reflection like story of being like obsessed with your own like image, literally. But I think it's like when we think about it more as like your image as a person versus like your literal face, it makes a lot more sense, where it's like, yeah, you know who gets a lot of respect? Doctors, lawyers, like people in these positions, like, and they know that, and that's like part of why they might end up in those positions, or like you said, right, end up around very vulnerable populations also, where it's like great arena for targeting. You have sort of ample people always coming to you to take advantage of, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you
And people and these people in, right, that they see, oh, there's this, there's this religious leader, there's this, leader of an organization, the leader of, the sports team, or right, whatever it is that, there's an inherent trust that comes in that position, which people who are predatory want that, right? They actually seek that out. Uh-oh, can you hear me?
your audio kind of went out a little bit.
Oh,
Did I lose connection?
um,
Well, I was going to comment about how intentional
Uh-oh.
people are,
Sorry.
because I don't think people who are not narcissists understand how intentional a narcissist actions are. And you think about like love bombing that has become more common, especially I think with the online dating, and how like you think, oh, this is a great, when someone comes and they're like, let's go do these big trips, and you're like, oh, this is great,
yeah, sounds great, right?
and they seem to love me so much, and then it's not, because they're getting people intentionally hooked on like an emotional hook, and then that leads them in, like, because they know once they get someone emotionally hooked, like it's harder for that other person to pull back and walk away. And so then right, and then they can manipulate that person a lot easier.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of this particular part of it is why we sort of thought about talking about this for this month, is sort of like the Valentine's Day of it all, the like idea of the large romantic gestures, the focus. I know I like to always talk with clients about like when we watch Disney movies as a child, that like we always focus on the like, how did they get together? How did they fall in love? Like this or that. And then we like don't see anything of like after they're actually in relationship, where we just sort of culturally in, I would say like US sort of like Hollywood mainstream society, focus on the romantic gestures, like and that is seen as in every rom-com as like the exciting thing. And it's like, unfortunately, that's also what toxic love bombing looks like. Like to me, again, working as someone that like works with relational clients, with couples, with people married, doing marital therapy, is that like, yeah, you can do those things, but really the full like healthy relationship is like showing up every day, being supportive, like working through conflict together, like some of the more like mundane, less exciting things. And that part is a lot harder to like consistently do, especially for a narcissist, right? Like they're going to be great at the romantic gestures and at the very public things and at the looking so loving and doting at the holiday party, like I talked about earlier. But then it's the actually thinking about your partner, showing up every day, working through hard times, that we don't get modeled a lot from like a media perspective, and we don't really get to see what that looks like for other people a lot of the time. And I think that that's part of why yeah, sort of like abusers or narcissists like can operate in this way. Like they don't, because we're so used to only looking for the really good, shiny things in other people's relationships, right? And sort of being like, oh man, they seem so good together and this or that, that we're not always asking the questions of like, do you feel super safe in your relationship? Like, do you feel loved and supported no matter what you do? Like, are they going to help take care of you when you're sick? I know that there's like data out there about that, like, yeah, often when women get sick, men leave relationships because of the sort of societal like upbringing of like, oh, women are supposed to be caretakers. It's like when the roles get reversed,
like there's such a high divorce rate when women get cancer from their husbands because of it.
Which it's like, it makes it very clear then of like, oh, so my role is caretaking and also caretaking for my adult partner. And oh, actually, it's not that you love me for everything I am, like through thick or thin. Oh no, it's actually that you're here for my caretaking, and when I no longer provide that.
Yeah, I remember hearing or reading a story, I think it was like on Instagram on one of the posts, because I see the post and then I always go to the comments because that's where the stories are.
The juicy stuff is.
Yeah. And someone had posted saying that their elderly neighbor couple, like the husband made the wife leave the hospital where she was in for cancer treatment early because he needed her to make him food.
Disgusting.
And I don't think that's an uncommon thing either, right? And it was just like, and I've also heard multiple people talk about how it's not uncommon for men to marry whoever they're with when they're ready. When they feel that they're ready to get married, then they're like, oh, I'm with this person. That's a good idea. It's not because they are madly in love with that person and want to marry them. They're just kind of a convenient option because they're there when men want to get married. So it's yeah.
It's all real depressing. That's like where I come where I come to. So yeah, I mean, maybe that we want to transition into like what are the healing tools? What are the practical applications? Like, how do we can know all of this and like, what do we do about it? Either in our own relationships or when we see other people that we're concerned about that might be in abusive relationships. Like, what do you do? How do you handle these things?
Well, I think something that Doris
I
just
think the biggest thing is kind of, oh, go ahead.
I think something that Doris just mentioned on there was about, that when we just get into a relationship for the sake of being in a relationship versus what is actually, really aligned and what feels healthy, what feels supportive and nourishing and equal and reciprocal. And I often find a lot of people will get into relationships thinking about the potential and, wearing those rose colored glasses of, well, maybe I can see things could be better. There's so much possibility. But, I think really we have to actually see what is the reality as it is right now and not how I want it to be, but how are things really right now? And is that good for me? Is this enough for me? Or am I going to be stuck in a cycle of constantly trying to, get someone to be who I need them to be, or to, help someone achieve things in their life, which is again that focus on the other, that someone with a narcissistic personality wants that, right? They want a partner who is going to invest everything into them to help them be successful. And so even just to like break that pattern of, no, I'm really rooted in myself, and I'm also really looking for someone who, is my equal and treats me as an equal, and not, with getting stuck with those rose colored glasses.
Yeah. Well, and that it's not your job in relationship to like improve someone. Like, even if they choose to do that work, that doesn't mean you have to be there for it. Like, that is a thing that I definitely talk about with relational clients sometimes, where I'm like, yeah, maybe they'll change, but like, do you really want to be the one that's just like waiting, like be it just like hoping that they're gonna do the work? Because that's also a lot of effort. And I know like a common pattern I see of when folks come into couples therapy is that it's often that one person has been feeling upset and resentful for literal years. And they finally, right, sort of like got the partner to come to therapy to try to work on things. Partner's like, oh my God, I had no idea. What do you mean I need to work on myself? Sorry, I'm like, clearly have feelings about this. And then often the person that's been resentful is already a little bit like, I don't know, like I might kind of be done with this, right? Like I'm not necessarily coming into therapy being like, I wonder if they'll change. And it's a little bit more of like, I've been telling you for years, right? I'm unhappy, or it doesn't feel like you're contributing enough to this relationship, or I feel like I'm doing everything, or like, yeah, you've been focusing on why I won't have sex with you and how rude that is, right? A common thing that also happens to people after they have children or after being recently pregnant is partners come in being like, they won't have sex with me. It's like, babe, it's not about you.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Because there's so many men that pressure women, especially in that postpartum period.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's like it makes it really clear that like, oh, it's not like you don't like love and adore me, and that's not why we're having sex. It's like you think I owe you sex, and when I am in a space where I set a boundary, right, where I sort of no longer participate in that because often my body literally is like healing and cannot handle it, and I have no sexual desire because I'm not sleeping and like I'm trying to heal, which takes a lot of energy. That then that partner like gets resentful or kind of holds that over their head, which again is like a thing I see that sometimes people point to of like, well, I was victimized too, and it's like, no, that's not, uh, that's not how it works. Like your partner does not owe you sex.
Mhm.
That's not a consensual relationship or like sexual dynamic. You can feel disappointed, like you can talk about some of these things, but you don't get to say, oh, they've been resentful for 5 years and one time they didn't have sex with me. And so these are the same. It's like, no, that's not it. And I think, yeah, oftentimes, I think probably similar to people trying to leave abusive relationships is that it takes kind of a long time to be able to like get to the part where you're actually like doing it and it's like happening. Right, it takes people a lot of time of like sort of planning and emotional work and realizing like, yeah, maybe I don't want to be here while I just wait for them to change, or I literally can't handle it anymore, or right, okay, finally I have people supporting me outside the relationship so I feel safe and like financially able to leave. And then, right, similar to like what a narcissist would do, that's when they come in with the love bombing, right? That's when they're like, oh no, like, don't leave me. Why would you do that to me? Like, here's how I'm going to show all my love to you, which again is like,
And
yeah.
then they're like, well, I can change or I'll change. But then you have to have an internal motivation to actually want to change. Like,
Yeah, and ideally it doesn't come from an external motivation that like the partner's going to leave you, right?
Mhm.
It's like you should want to change already, or like in general, or that should be a like self-realization you come to. And then, right, your partner gets to decide, is that work I want to do or what want to like witness to or be supportive of while you're doing it.
Right.
Um,
It's like court ordered therapy. Does it really work? Because
it's
they're
not
being
consensual, really. Yeah.
right.
Well, and I think that's why
So,
this,
Camille,
education on these dynamics is so important. Right? That when we really understand what is actually going on and we start to learn about it, it can help us to recognize what's really happening and to kind of see through the manipulation of it all. And, this is why often when I tell clients when they're thinking about leaving but really struggling with that decision, and that they'll have that clarity in therapy, but then they go back and they lose all clarity with their person. I tell clients, write down a list of everything that you do not like about this relationship, every time this person has hurt you, every negative quality, negative event, and keep that with you to remember. Because sometimes a lot of us, I think, that trauma response too, where you maybe even dissociate a little bit, and that we need to actually help ourselves stay in the present moment and stay with the truth that this is not a good relationship. And it's hard for people to sit with that sometimes.
Yeah. Camille, with your history as a sex therapist, how do you define sex addiction?
Yeah, it's a big topic, but I'll try to keep it short, which is that, yeah, I definitely have sometimes clients come into therapy using words about sex addiction, or pornography addiction would be like another one, that sometimes there's what I would call like a rupture in the relationship, right? There's some hurt that has happened, and often people are coming into therapy to try to work on healing that, right? Like in a relationship. But personally, and what I've learned through sort of sex therapy training and education, is that in the way that we think about the addiction model of substance abuse, the way that some drugs act, in that there are sort of like withdrawal periods and things like that, that truly, and the research says, and sex therapists say, that sex addiction, in the way we think about other types of addiction, does not exist. That would be sort of like my thing would be like, no, that's not a thing. I think, right, we can all have behaviors that maybe we don't love about ourselves, or we might have tendencies to like abuse, or like I guess by that I mean like use social media when we're like feeling overwhelmed, or like we have strategies or coping strategies that are maybe not always ultimately very beneficial to ourselves to like get through things. So I can imagine that sometimes sex or pornography like is a coping strategy. But I think in the way that we understand addiction models, like in therapy world and substance abuse therapy, is that it is not the same. In There's sort of, again, like mainstream ideas about when men are denied sex, like we have, right, the terminology around like blue balls, which is like not a thing that exists in like terminology for the female body, right? We don't really have a correlation to that that gets talked about in that way. And yeah, I think there is
Our
this
ovaries don't get blue when we don't get.
well, and like there is physically nothing in the body that like negatively happens in the way that like an addiction does when you are denied sex. Like, yes, we all are sexual people. Humans are sexual. That doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be with other people. We have sexual relationships with ourselves. Like, I'm not denying that. And that doesn't mean ever that anyone like owes you sex, or that by like denying that in relationship is like a basic human need. We don't need sex in the way that we need food or water, right? And that's like why I think when we talk about it from this kind of like addiction place, it can get into kind of like harmful territory, because it starts to get talked about as like, well, this is a need and my partner's not meeting that need.
Right.
First of all, like you can ask for something from someone, your partner or other people you're in a relationship with. That doesn't mean that they have to do that, right? Like it's still, this is something you're asking for and they get to decide whether they're going to give that or not. And that can happen with anything in any relationship. So that's never really true to owe that. But yeah, and there are also like, I would say like, I'm going to try to like be nice and about it, but I'm like, there are definitely people who make their entire business off of talking about sex addiction especially on the internet. And most of the time, those people are not therapists, or they did not go to sex therapy school or education for that. Often they are associated with religious bodies. Often they are selling a lot of products, I would say, and courses and things like that. And so a lot of the times when you see, because that most of us have seen, but like an article in a newspaper about sex addiction or like these or that, or rates of divorce or unhappiness or things related to sex, like in mainstream media, a lot of times those are the people they are talking to. They are not healthcare professionals where this is their job and training is in sex and like sexual education, or like working with therapeutic clients. So yeah, in my understanding, that's like where a lot of the language comes from. And again, it sort of perpetuates, right, to talk about systems, it perpetuates the idea that people are owed sex by not giving sex. That's like a withdrawal symptom, right, of talking about it from a sex addiction perspective. And then I guess sort of overall, like, what am I trying to say? That, yeah, it just impacts a lot of ideas about relationships, and sort of makes it this like transactional discussion.
Well, that's the big thing, is it makes it transactional, right?
Yeah.
Like you see sex as a transaction, something that you are owed because you do something for someone else and therefore they owe you something back and you want it as sex. It's not something that is mutually agreed upon necessarily. And you see that a lot too in women who like give in to having sex, where they don't, like, they feel that is the safer option versus not doing it.
Yeah.
Because it is felt as a transaction and not as a mutual agreement that you agree upon to do this. So do you feel that when one partner is saying that they have a sex addiction, like it's more of a like an emotional coping mechanism that they're using sex for?
Yeah, that's like the other piece that I was like starting to think about was that, yeah, men are often socialized that like physical comfort is the only like intimacy they are allowed to have, right? Often that includes sex, or they are taught that idea to include sex. And, right, often men don't allow themselves or are not taught how to have any other kind of intimacy. Which, and by that I mean like the literal word of intimacy, which is like knowing someone, right? Like sharing vulnerability, things with them, feeling supported, feeling like there's sort of like an unconditional love aspect to it. And so I think that's often sort of why it gets kind of like put in this particular category of like, because it's very true that like a lot of men also co-regulate through sex when they're emotionally distressed. That is a way to feel better. And sometimes, right, if they are denied that, to kind of use that language, they do feel very desperate. If you have no other way to feel connected to someone, to feel supported, to feel like emotionally okay, like I can understand why we have gotten to the place that we have with that. It's just that doesn't necessarily make it okay. And so like when I, yeah, again, work with relational clients, it's trying to figure out for those folks, like how else can you, right? Like, can we learn how to share our emotions? Can we talk about vulnerability? If you really need something like physical as a co-regulation or as a regulatory system, like, and by that I mean like regulating your nervous system, like go on a run, like work out, like like often that is what a lot of people do or like find themselves doing anyway. And that can be like a similar avenue that of course like you can do on your own and does not require the consent of others or like kind of get into the messiness of trying to figure out like if I need this, how are, you know, how do I ask for this? um yeah, I think that answered your question.
Yeah.
That's why I'm curious,
But
as
I
we're
also know we're, yeah,
as we're kind of a little
yeah,
over
go ahead.
time today, and I'm wondering if maybe we can just shift and think about what is one thing when we think about what when love turns toxic, what's one thing that we want to leave our listeners with as, kind of a main point
Mhm.
today.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm staring at our document right now, and one of the things we wrote was isolation is the biggest threat to someone being stuck. And I think that, like, for me, that is one of the big things is that if you don't have community outside of your partner, outside of like that relationship, that is a dangerous place to be, no matter what that relationship looks like, even if it's very healthy, right? Because then again, like in the sort of co-regulation thing that we were just talking about, it's like if you only have one person that like is supportive of you and like helps when you're vulnerable and helps on these things, like you're going to feel very desperate for that connection, no matter kind of what they're doing and how that relationship works. So I think like having community, having other people that you can talk to about like your challenges or struggles, like could be a therapist, could be a friend, could be extended family members, could even be like a hotline, like, right, there are resources like that for kind of talking through some of these things. And I think that that also helps. Like a lot of people come into therapy for relationship therapy, and what they tell me is they want a third party, right? They want someone that can kind of help them look at what's happening in the relationship and help them figure out either how to do things better or how to prevent some of the challenging things, or to provide perspective on things they feel stuck in, or right, that they kind of are triggering each other about. And so that's like another benefit, right, of having other people around you and supportive systems, is that not everyone is necessarily like either relying on one person for everything. And also just that, like, hopefully, if you have like a supportive system and have systematic resources for things, live in a community where there are shelters. There's like money for helping people get out of stuck situations. That really makes things easier, because it's not just that people don't leave because they don't think the relationship is that bad or it's not bad all the time. A lot of times it's like, I don't have the money to leave, right? I'm financially tied to this person. No one believes me. I have pets and I don't know where to go. A lot of shelters don't necessarily accept pets or like allow children into them. So if you have more like dependents of any kind, it can be even more challenging to find a space to stay in before you can kind of figure out what the longer term solutions are.
I think that also goes back to our culture, especially here in the US, of how you find your one person, right? And then that person is your world. And so then your whole life is wrapped up around this one person. And we're not cultured to have a community. It's like the single family household where it's the two parents and kids, and you may have grandparents, but like your whole world becomes just this single household. And I think the biggest thing because when you have friends and you're talking about your relationship, they can give you a different perspective of what's going on, because it's sometimes really hard to see abusive relationship because it doesn't always look like it does on TV or what you hear about, right? Like, it's not just all physical abuse. There's a lot of emotional and psychological abuse that can happen, and you don't necessarily recognize it, especially with a narcissist, because it can be so subtle. And there's a lot of gaslighting. So then you're like, well, am I the problem? Am I the issue? Did I cause this, right? Like, did I cause this person to act this way? And you really need that outside perspective to be like, to tell you, be like, no, like, this is an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
And you don't always see that when you're in it.
Yeah. And I think like having even like healthy relationships to compare it to, right? Like, again, ideally that is what you would see in a community, is like, oh, maybe, right, I didn't think mine was that bad, but when I compare it to this other relationship, oh, now I'm starting to realize like, I don't see them putting down their partner, or I don't see them crying after, right, like stressful events because they don't feel supported, or they're made to feel it's all their fault. Like sometimes, and that's why I think it's so hard, because we don't get modeled, right, again, like in the Disney movies or in our media of any kind. Like, we usually just get the idea of like the bad, like here's the thing you shouldn't do, and then here's the sort of like Disney-fied version of like what a amazing relationship is, and then it's like, well, what's the everyday relationship look like? Like, where do we find those like models? Because again, for a lot of people, like, they didn't have that growing up, right? They didn't have like that sort of like healthy relationship model. Sometimes people do, even if it's not your own, like in your own family, sometimes you see that, and that's really helpful as
But I
well.
think the last thing that I want to leave our listeners with is just to remember that there is no shame of being in a toxic relationship. And it is far more common than I think we all realize. And hopefully, spaces like this, that we can start to hold these conversations and break down the stigma, and to really create more of a culture around compassion, that it is not your fault. You are not the problem. And so thank you, everyone, for listening in today on this topic.
Yeah. So you can join us for a new theme every month in our unhinged exploration of trauma, power, and what it really means to heal.
And remember, you are not the problem.
Unless you are.